sort of table. It's looking better. Good morning.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator. I could close the door for you.
Are we ready? Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. Today we are going to meet our crossover deadlines, and we are such a productive committee. This committee worked till 6:30 last night. I'm so grateful to all of us for rowing together and doing some heavy lifting. So this morning we're going to begin with our project-based infrastructure financing proposal. We have two key decisions to make before we go any further. And then we're going to go through the housing bill and we're going to make decisions. So the two decisions, as I understand them, and John, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll frame up the two decisions.
Sure. So John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. The decisions that the chair is referencing are how to treat affordability. So how much are you designating as affordable? What are the criteria for that? And then how much of the stimulated development how much of that floor area should be dedicated to housing? It's currently set at 50%. If you wanted to make this more of a mixed use approach, you could lower that figure. And I know that there have been discussions last time about doing that. So talking about those figures in relationship to how much is dedicated to housing and how are you treating affordability? I think the two kind of technical questions. There are other conversations that could be had, but that's what I understand to be.
I understand those are the two decisions you need to redraft this and drop it into our housing bill so that we will be able to walk through the whole housing bill. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because I think other than that, Chip is ready to go, pretty much. So question for everyone. I think we have two choices on affordability. A, do we want to put the constraints of affordability onto the housing that we are hoping to do with the infrastructure? If we do if we want to make it affordable, do we set a pretty high threshold? Do we have a percent that's a higher threshold and a percent that's just housing that's fair, that would be fair market housing? You could, we could, let's say we just kept 50% for the moment. We could have 20% of the other 50% of affordable housing at 575 FPL and below, and then the rest could be fair market value, for example. So within the affordability, you could have some ranges as well, or we could make the decision to not put the constraints on it of affordable. And I would remind us all that affordable is now very middle class housing. Affordable is working workforce housing. It is not Section 8 housing. It is housing that our professionals can afford. Our teachers, our lawyers, our all the people that this economy relies on. So I would just make sure that we're all clear that affordable does not mean lower, super lower income.
So you had to describe it that way. It says how it's perceived. And we should think about whether or not this is a better term to use.
Workforce might be a better term.
Well, I want to think about that a little bit.
Okay, we don't have too much time to think
We
about
never have time to think about it.
No, I know.
Unless we always amend.
That was our time between 6:30 and 8 was our time to think. So
But it needs another name. I'm very
I
serious
agree.
about that.
I don't disagree. So what are people thinking? David, you have some thoughts on this?
Let me listen to you guys first, and then I'll tell you. I just want to make sure I frame that right.
Sure. So on the 575, that's what we do with childcare. And
Yeah.
that allows for a lot of accessibility. And that's what I see in draft here. So I'm fine with that. As for the housing piece, I think for this to be salient throughout the building, it needs to be tied to housing. So I like 50%, but 25% I think is debatable, but 50% is mixed use, right? That is allowing 50% of the project to not be necessarily. So I can go either way on that one. No, this one.
Affordable. So, sorry, your affordable or workforce housing at 575% FPL up to that, which pairs us with childcare, which and gives us a nice, really middle income range. And 50% be that and 50% mixed use.
But I could go lower, maybe so desires. I don't
Okay,
know.
those are the two choice points we have. We have affordable or not affordable housing, Tasha. Oh, and the second decision John needs is what's the percent of housing versus mixed use? Or any other use.
Okay.
Those are the, and we've heard that the penciling out is a challenge, may or may not be a challenge at 50%. Is that right, Alex?
Yes.
I mean,
So the two figures are how much floor area is dedicated to housing. Currently that's set at 50%. And if you're accepting an affordability constraint on this, how much of the housing would be quote unquote affordable housing, whatever that might be, what you're talking
or
about.
workforce
The
housing.
565.
So Thomas has led with pairing it with childcare at 575. And I would just love other people's thoughts on this first piece.
I'm fine with it, I think.
I don't know if you've heard from anyone around the room, but CCFAP was already set up to function based on FPL. There's no equivalent system to measure somebody's, and I was even feeling like I was going to run into that with AMI, but
This is FPL.
no, I know either one. I'm trying to think about who would then be responsible for measuring people's income. That was where I got stuck anyway on the whole concept, because there's no CCFAP for housing, which is already an existing infrastructure that is expensive to recreate.
We have that for AMI.
We don't have that for AMI. So I was probably gonna run into the same issue, but FPL is very specific to like human services type programs.
But I don't think anybody measures the income in these things. They do like benchmarks, right? They do what?
Yeah, the AMI would be more of a benchmark than FPL is a entitlement cutoff.
Well, for Betsy, the plus of using FPL is what they have. My understanding from Betsy when Jessica was in the room was that was something they could manage. Is that correct, Alex? Are you speaking for the department today?
Just my department, Betsy. If Jess is comfortable with FPL, that's
She was comfortable with
Betsy.
575.
I mean,
That's my understanding.
the senator's right that FPL is not often used in housing. And generally in housing, you'd use an AMI.
Yeah. I don't want to use a new measure in housing that
And you could
changes.
try to peg it to a similar income threshold, whatever
Exactly.
575 FPL
Exactly.
translates into an AMI.
Well,
That's
Right.
the way to do that.
consistency of result on the one hand and ease of obtaining it are the critical.
And I guess
And
what,
also confidence that the information you get
Right.
is accurate.
that's where I'm gonna try to get myself back on the tracks, which is when you said FPL, it was making me think we're gonna measure people's income. But if you use AMI, you can tag it to that affordability level without asking anyone for their income.
I'm not sure that everybody here knows what all these abbreviations.
Federal poverty level versus
Right.
earned median income, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think I may have disrupted the flow of this conversation a couple days ago when I asked to try to compare the two.
I didn't mean to not so vigorously.
And so from health and welfare, federal poverty index level, very clear, good charts. AMI,
We have the same charts and we were sent them
We,
by
We're about like 150% of AMI.
Yeah,
I feel like somebody.
that's-
or
I said
200. Actually, you-
200%.
200.
uh,
And that equates, do we have a notion of what that equates to on
For-
FPL?
well,
For
and
Davis.
I don't, I want to acknowledge Senator Brock's point a few days ago. It's 100% AMI in Chittenden County is $95,000. That is used for Grand Island, Franklin as well. That could be seen as a good or bad thing. That means that anyone up to $180,000, then 40% of those units have to be affordable, which means 30% of that income. They can't spend more than 30% of that income on their housing. So they can't spend more than, $60,000 a year on housing. And that would be more in the ownership
Right.
category.
That was something I was gonna ask, is if you want to go this route and you kind of course stick with AMI and just
Yeah,
move upwards what those figures are,
right.
you might want two different numbers, one for owners and one for
Right.
investors.
Yeah, maybe we do 150 for rental and 200 for ownership.
Let me just pull, somebody sent us a chart on AMI, and I, at this moment.
They used to keep there was a there is like an AMI dial spectrum that's like up to 80% AMI is considered very affordable housing, 80-120 is workforce, 120 onward is middle income housing above a certain level of it.
AMI,
Somebody sent it.
AMI is different for each county.
AMI's location based,
There
but
it is,
if, yeah,
By county.
yeah.
I like the
essentially.
AMI, and 150 or 200% AMI makes a lot of sense.
Well, that-
But, you know, the accuracy of where you are in a county can be very, very different.
Yes,
These are the income levels.
I guess.
Not necessarily representative.
Right, so the up to is my question, would you rather go up to 150, which is more like, my math is really like $135,000 instead of 180. You're the math one.
So the median household income for Chittenden County.
I'm just
is
trying to
89.
find,
It's 90 instead of 95, that makes my math easy.
This is from.
Dave,
We already said that.
Yes, ma'am.
So.
on the fly, I can't.
So on the fly, I'll just add that. I think that project-based tips are just equally applicable to housing as they are to economic development, and I'm not sure why we're trying to so cleanly separate the two. I don't think we should create a distinction between the two. If project-based tips positively affect economic development, it shouldn't be at the expense of housing and vice versa. I don't see the need to make a distinction between project-based tip is project-based tip, and it's good for good community.
To me, the public good is the infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's a public good right now. I mean, we have like cleanup issues, we have, just capacity issues everywhere. We just need more infrastructure in our communities, so that's the public. good.
We need more infrastructure, but we're in a housing crisis. So I think,
We're in an economic development crisis
Yeah.
as well. And we
not as
have
much as a
been
housing crisis.
in my neck of the woods.
Mhm.
True.
We're in an infrastructure.
Okay, so this began as a tool to both increase infrastructure and to increase housing. So what is that? That then pivots us to the second question, which is what percent do we want to be housing, or do we just let it go, not even mention housing? I think, given that we have it's a housing bill, I would feel more comfortable with 8% that this, needs to be priority housing.
Well, I'm looking at Megan because,
Okay,
and I'll say why. Because I think we put housing in because otherwise housing was having a hard time being considered as the basis for a larger TIF project. I mean, that TIF projects have been transportation corridors or, so I think we want to include housing, but it doesn't have to be housing.
Yeah, Megan Sullivan, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and former Executive Director of the Vermont Economic Progress Council, which oversaw the TIF program. So I know a lot about TIF. So the way the TIF district program works is you apply for the application. What the community is doing is talking about the infrastructure. What are the improvements that are going to be made? And then they have to, for the district, say that those infrastructure projects will lead to 3 public good outcomes out of 5. And those include the development of affordable housing, the new jobs. I forget what the other 3 are. It's been a few years. But so because there's a separation between building the infrastructure and then having the development come along. It should be somewhat coordinated, so
Yes.
the increment is coming, but the idea is the TIF or CHIP or Spark or HIT or whatever we're calling it,
We're calling it chip.
the CHIP is supporting the infrastructure that is going to be built.
Mhm.
And then next step is development. And so you know, the community isn't the developer of the housing. So it's a little tricky for someone like Betsy. And if Jessica said that they can do this, I don't want to step on that, to say, okay, is the housing that's getting developed after this infrastructure has been put in place going to meet these standards? And so is there someone who does that might be able to help on that next few years certification? TIF districts self-certify. They self-certify, yes, affordable housing has been built. Yes, jobs have been created. And that's reported and can be.
Thomas, and then I'm going to ask John, because don't we have self-certification?
Create compromise. Sorry, go ahead.
We don't have any specific provisions, but you could have that in
Yeah.
for this, which is I think the way that it works.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to put this on today because if it has to be written up, hopefully it's not complicated, but what about the increment for any 50% housing project, 100% goes to it, but anything with less than 50% housing, or how about this? No housing, maybe gets a smaller portion of the increment. Don't we do that with TIP projects now anyway, where depending on the project, a certain percentage of the increment is eligible?
Well, I mean, it's
Most projects are.
district wide. And so I guess it's also how you think about project. Project might cover 10 parcels. I'm just thinking back to the original example of Westford. I think there were 10 parcels in that example project-based TIF. And one parcel or 3 parcels were going to have housing units. And it was like 3 units here, 6 units here, 3 units here. And then there was going to be a redevelopment of the general store, which would be mixed use. So there was housing, but it's not like a project is going to be necessarily one building. If you build out a water sewer line, the project could have a new town facility like South Burlington has with their town offices, a new commercial or industrial and housing. And they may come online at different times because you're working with different developers.
But
That's what and that's the district. But so the town for a project should have a plan to say, this is where we want housing. This is where we want commercial and industrial or mixed use. So they may not come online all at the same time, but that's the plan that they've
They
created.
may not, but I don't see a project-based TIF happening without a developer with a very clear vision of what they're using it for.
Multiple developers.
Right.
It could be multiple.
Or most.
It could be a half mile of infrastructure.
Yeah,
It serves everything
Right.
along the way.
That's-
Some housing, some.
But that's the project is the infrastructure. So that one
Right.
project,
Yeah.
that one incurrence of debt is the infrastructure, which hopefully will lead to lots of the development in that
Mhm.
small area that the.
so I just want to ground us, and I'm grounding myself too, in the how we've gotten from A to B is that we as a committee believe TIF is a valuable tool, and it is hard for most communities to take advantage of who are not large and sophisticated and have a huge tax base. So this version, the value of it is making it a smaller amount of debt that you're taking on, or, a smaller liability on your books. And the developer or someone else who's involved in this project can help take on the financing or the debt repayment. That's built into this? People get those things.
The developer can take on the financing.
Right.
Yes. Can I just throw out one thing? Because I think there's some confusion earlier this week. The infrastructure is available for all kinds of things. It is not exclusive
Right.
to housing.
Exactly.
The sole thing that this is checking is, does the housing development site, which is meant to be stimulated, the housing development that's meant to be stimulated by this improvement, include a specified percentage of housing? It's not to say that you can't have all kinds of other things, and you would expect that infrastructure.
Well,
to-
but I mean, in a way, it's saying you can't move forward unless a certain percentage of the project is housing.
Right.
Yes,
So
yes,
that's still a question.
to get in the door, you
Yeah.
need to have a housing development piece. That's really the fact.
So I'm,
But I'm with David that why to make things up a little bit.
Leanne may have some words about that.
I feel like we're torturing ourselves to make this more complicated than it needs to be.
I agree.
It's just a smaller TIF for infrastructure that the community has identified as a valuable good where other entities can help the municipality, mitigate the risk of taking on that debt.
I agree with you. On the other hand, you are the woman who is always telling us we're in a housing crisis.
We're in
We're in a housing crisis. We're in an everything crisis, but after listening to the radio this morning, we're in a bigger crisis. So I think that I would propose that we still keep 1%, and I'm going to just boldly put this out here, that we call it workforce housing, that we look at either 30 or 40% and divide it in half, the percent that needs to be at any kind of affordable amount, like whatever we have, 200 AMI, and then the other rest fair market value. And then the rest, 60% or 70%, assumed for mixed use and general economic development.
I am getting a little confused about if you're piling on the percentages, because I wish we had like a smart board in here or something, but
You think that
I'm going to throw out an alternative proposal, which is 25% is housing. Just because I think that guarantees there is housing as part of the project, but it doesn't have to be the main reason the only reason that you do.
And then just do housing and not indicated.
So I just didn't know if 25% of the project is housing, and then you're saying 40% of that.
No, I was trying to be easy and say to go down to either 40 or 30% of it has to be housing with half and half fair market value and some degree of affordability. John, you think that's?
I'm just trying to think of how that would, so you'd have a 25% floor area restriction that has to be available for housing.
And maybe let's just leave it at that. Maybe let's just make it simple.
Let's start there. Yeah.
Just do that and just say housing has to be 25% of this project and the rest is available for any type of economic development. Right?
25% of the land area?
Yeah, 25% of what?
Gross floor area.
All projects?
No.
No. I get that.
What's the 25% off? That's what I'm asking for.
Sorry, I'm not.
Okay, so let's say we build a half mile out from the village. 25% of that half mile.
So the improvement is separate from, I think this is where there's.
Yeah, but it's a grand, it's not just a single facility. It's a series of facilities down that stretch, down that infrastructure
It
stretch.
could
Oh,
be.
sure. If you're saying that the housing development site is a stretch of buildings that are developed, the
Right.
requirement as written here would be of the floor area available in that full stretch, 25%.
Yeah, but it starts on day one and eventually grows to be fully populated by businesses and houses.
Right.
So what are you measuring 25% of? The end result, but you don't know the end result.
I'm entirely with David because the infrastructure could serve many things down. You could build a parking lot with it that serves housing that isn't considered part of the TIF
To be,
project.
yeah, to be clear, developers can do all sorts of things outside of the housing development site, and they are advantaged by the infrastructural improvement. The sole
But the
ticket
money for the TIF,
just goes to financing the infrastructural improvements. It doesn't go to the housing
so
development.
then what are you measuring? That 25% of what hooked up to the infrastructure
Exactly.
is housing.
What it measures is the housing development site. How much of that development is dedicated to
So
housing?
we get all that, but on day one, if there's a half mile of new infrastructure and the first projects are housing,
Yeah.
okay, they would be limited to 20, 25, 50, whatever, to Senator Chittenden's point, that would be housing, but that would be day one. Day two, there's a shopping complex.
Yes,
It's got zero housing, but you've already passed the threshold. You've already allowed the project to go. It
So-
just doesn't make any sense. I mean, why are we creating all these limitations?
So I think that what you're identifying is that there's a difference for big TIF. It's anticipating stimulated development. In this case, it's saying there's a necessary plan for development to occur as a result of this. So what it's checking is basically the housing development plan, which sets out the floor areas and the like, but it doesn't speak to anything about the development near the infrastructure that isn't the housing development site. So there is a way to check the housing development plan. So it's not on day one, I have to walk in and see how much floor area was dedicated today. And then 2 weeks later, I got to go back and see if the business had moved in and changed it. I take your point that there are administrative questions as to how this works, but that's the concept.
Right, and this is the proposal that is housing based in its value. It's what we're trying to do is prioritize these smaller projects and have a significant percent of them.
But Spark isn't housing based.
It's broader. It doesn't specify just how.
It doesn't specify.
I think everybody says in the building now, when it leaves economic development, it's as strong as it's going to get for meeting the market and economic needs of a community. I personally believe that's going to be housing for a long time, but we've seen huge swings in, the value of commercial, the value of housing, the need for these things in different parts of the state. I think it should leave here as flexible as possible, and we can have that fight elsewhere.
Okay.
It's flexible and it's simple.
Flexible and
One of the
simple.
things that you think about is if you're putting in infrastructure that has a potential future value for other projects over and above the one that you're thinking about now, how do you structure something in which the community, whoever, gets some economic value from that, the same as you would if it were TIF? Now, it may simply be through the taxes associated with the use of that additional item, whether it be water, sewer, or whatever. I'm not sure, but that's just something I want you to try to think through.
So what I'm hearing, I know they're going to have to wait a minute. This is key important for us to make.
They are good people for the conversation.
We've got them. And if they actually, this may be a moment where we include our two witnesses because they may have input on this, but I think my thought, and John, what's your time like?
I can stay here. Do you want me out of the chair?
No, they're on the screen. Because what I'm hearing is that we just bag a housing requirement altogether, that leave it as flexible as possible. I would love to have some language, I think, with somewhere that makes it that these projects would hopefully make it a priority of housing in these. I think we have to have a priority articulated
Let's
somewhere.
listen to Jonah and Zeke because they've been very thoughtful partners on these conversations who do housing in communities where it's harder to develop, and they maybe heard some of this conversation.
Right. I don't know. Welcome, Zeke and Jonah. We are including you in our we have to make a decision about two things. One is, are these project-based infrastructure tax financing areas, are they going to have an affordable housing component? Are they going to have a housing component that's identified by %? Or are they going to be super flexible and enable all economic development in that more limited project-based area? And so we're at a decision point on this. And so we welcome you. Zeke, you've been in before, so you know who we are, but Jonah, you haven't. So we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. And we're going to be with Thomas. Thomas.
Oh, Tom Chittenden. Is that right? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, Chittenden County.
Keisha Hinsdale, and I want to give them some breathing room because I think they are also a little bit prepared to say, on top of any project-based TIF or whatever, it's being developed infrastructure-wide, what else would help in mid-sized communities for housing that's far more specific?
Right.
So we're not trying to use this to meet needs that it simply isn't equipped to meet.
Absolutely. Allison Clarkson. Jonah, I'm an Upper Valley person just like you. And I am I'm one of the senators for the Windsor District. It's great to have you.
I'm Randy Brock. I represent Franklin County and Northern Grand Isle County.
Hey, good morning, guys. We representing Rockland County.
So you may have some other, Zeke has been a terrific and productive partner with us as we work through all these things. Jonah, we welcome you, and we've seen some of your projects, very exciting. Those are the two decision points we're making at the moment. We will be getting a housing bill. We can do more housing once we get we're after crossover. But right now, we're really trying to focus on the bill in front of us. And obviously, there are some additional things we can be thinking about. But at the moment, we need to make and pass out a bill by 11:30, I hope, this morning. So who would like to go first?
I just have to hop off, not to hog the stage. I have to hop off at 9 for a client call. So
Go, you're all good.
Jonah,
Again.
why don't you
Go ahead.
go first and let it rip? Introduce
Okay.
yourself and go for the gusto.
Yep. So hey, nice to meet you all. Jonah Richard. I'm down in Fairleigh. Run two small businesses here. One is a home building and general contracting business, and the other is a small scale real estate development business. We focus primarily on projects that are less than 20 units. We do housing, mostly affordable and workforce these days. And we do some retail and commercial. The total population of the area we're working in between Fairleigh and Bradford is roughly 5,000 people. So just to give you a sense of the scale that we're operating in. It sounds like what I had prepared on my end was I was looking through the draft bill last night. I have a couple points of feedback on that, but it sounds like we want to be even more targeted, specifically about any like affordability restrictions.
I think what we'd appreciate, and the committee can chime in, but we have a very limited amount of time. We would love to hear how you might use a project-based infrastructure tax financing,
Okay.
Like the one we are discussing.
Okay.
That's what we need help on at the moment.
I got a great example. All right. So we're working on a 15-unit for sale condo project in Bradford. It's a cottage court type development on an acre parcel of land. You get a mix of small single family houses and a couple of duplexes. And the idea is to create some sort of starter housing for, singles or couples, because there's just such a lack of that in our area. It's on a vacant acre site. We're looking at roughly $3.9 million in total development costs. And I ran some quick numbers based on the guidelines for what we could potentially finance if we're able to capture some of that tax increment. And if we're able to allocate 80% of the education and municipal taxes towards paying off debt, we could gain an extra $550,000 or 15% of the project budget. So if you put it, a lot of the projects that we're working on are unique to rural areas because we don't have, we're not doing the large greenfield projects where we're doing 50, 100, 200 unit projects that have public infrastructure that we can pass off to the municipality, right? We're not building big roads. We're not building, we don't have to run big sewer lines or water lines they're all already on infrastructure for the most part, except for the case of some of the small towns like Fairleigh where we have to put in private septic systems. So it's a little more, when you look at the restrictions of a traditional TIF district, which can only be allocated to public infrastructure. If we keep those same restrictions, and it seems like the bill right now is not worded like it would be, but just want to make sure, if we kept those same restrictions as TIF is implemented today, it would cut out a lot of these rural projects, like a lot of the work.
So Jonah, we've actually discussed this and we're talking about these as public goods, not necessarily public purpose or to be publicly purposed. So that a big septic system or water system or well could serve, let's say, a 15 to 20 unit housing project, and the housing project would be a public good. And I think the committee is committed to a broader notion of public purpose to being a public good, which may involve private ownership of some aspects of the infrastructure. Am I correct? Is that
Not the infrastructure.
Well, the infrastructure, that's what Joan is saying, is a septic tank. A huge septic tank might be just what they need to make housing in a small town, not a whole water and sewer project. Is that what I'm hearing you say, Jonah?
Exactly. Yeah. Like Fairleigh doesn't have a municipal sewer system, and they're not going to implement one for a single project. So we're necessarily going to have to put in a private septic system for a lot of
Do both Spark and CHIP have an entity other than the municipality able to?
I know Spark does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
They
This
both
was the
have.
point of the public good
This-
language, was to permit specifically.
Permit
Yeah.
private developers to
That was
take on,
the genesis of that.
I think
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
the key piece of it,
so they could privately own the infrastructure.
right? But it serves a public good.
No, right, I'm just thinking.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Joan. I just wanted to say that we have,
Okay, so I'm
it's-
glad that's on the table. Okay. Another consideration I think would be really helpful to look at is whether for sale housing versus rental housing would be eligible. We do a lot of, rental housing projects, but I think there's a big lack of home ownership opportunities for workforce housing, right? It just doesn't.
this does both, owner occupied and rental.
Okay, great. Another specific nuance that I saw in the draft bill was a section that has the affordability restriction, or it says if the project doesn't pencil with AMIs at 200%, then it wouldn't be eligible for the TIF or the HIP program. 200% AMI in our area for a 2-bedroom unit apartment equals $4,600 a month. Any project that we do will underwrite at $4,600 a month in rent for a 2-bedroom unit, but we're never going to be able to achieve that here. That's far exceeds what any person can afford in our area, even though that's technically what 200% AMI is. So I'd recommend maybe backing down that language if you can.
Thomas,
What is it up to then? So
it's up to, but
It had to be affordable to someone at that income, meaning if you made less than that, it would not be affordable to you. But this is also why you would distinguish between owner and renter. So if you
I
had
see.
150%, you could have a different figure for the rental figure.
Well, but hang on. A
Cal,
developer,
introduce yourself.
I'm sorry. Alex Farrell, Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development. Under the current language, a developer could choose to price it below that, which is what Jonah's asking for.
Yes.
Yeah,
I believe so.
this doesn't prohibit the developer from pricing at a lower figure.
That's
Yeah.
the,
the upper limit.
that's the upper limit.
It's that,
So
yeah,
the way
it's-
I'm reading this, it says the development would not have included housing affordable to a household with an income less than 200%, but
This-
for the proposed tax increment revenues.
this language has been pulled out. This was the.
Right, yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
fair.
There's a new,
As of this morning.
as of this morning, there is 4.1, I believe. Is that right, John?
Yes,
As of this morning, under John's name, under John Gray's name, our wonderful patient legislative council.
I have a proposal. Because there will be some necessary complexity, but we are not going to get it right for every community, every county. Can we, because they're not in the room, so I'm gonna volunteer them, can we get VHFA involved if there is a housing component to a project to determine the project's eligibility based on certain affordability requirements?
I mean, have VHFA work with FEPC to do the
If there's
income
how-
determination?
If there's housing involved, they are the best to administer missing middle housing requirements. But I don't want to sit here and try to say 1% works in Middlebury and 1% works in Fairleigh and micromanage this threshold.
Okay.
Jonah, would you mind if I jumped in and we sort of tag teamed this a little bit?
Yeah,
I'll
see,
give
you're
you the
welcome
floor back
to
because I know
tag
you have to
team
leave
and
at 9 and I
Right.
can stay longer. Zeke Davison, Summit Properties. I've met you all, but thank you for those reintros. I think the point Jonah is making is that 150 or 200% AMI rents are above current market rents, meaning anything, the developer will price it lower because the developer has to absorb it, right? So I think which kind of for me also underscores the fact that especially in a lot of parts of the state, you just can't build housing that the market will support at current construction costs, right? That's why we're here today talking about leveraging future tax dollars. So at almost any income level, you just can't build a project that's going to work. And so what I would say is certainly big A affordable, is not the right threshold. And I think I watched some of the testimony from earlier this week, and I think Legislative Council added some placeholder language to spark this conversation. And then you started talking about going up to 150 or 200. There's complicated commercial TIF, district TIF. This is a less complicated project-based TIF, but it still is, a barrier to entry. And in this place, I still think what you're hoping to do is use this to stimulate new developments that are not otherwise happening. Like that is already true, regardless of any income level. They're not otherwise happening, and this is what it's targeting to. I think that the income levels are unnecessary for this. To Senator Ram Hinsdale's point.
See, would you have a percent? So I hear you on that. But would you create a percent of the project that would need to be housing? And, we've talked about 30, 25%, right now in the draft, it's 50% housing. Right. Would you identify an amount that needs to be housing, or would you let it be silent on that so it's the most flexible?
Yeah, so moving away from an AMI specifically for housing and asking about the other thing you've been debating, which is the percentage that needs to be housing versus commercial retail. A little out of my element there. We do housing purely. And so we don't operate in a world where we need to understand like what percentage is retail, what percentage is housing in order to get a project to pencil, right? So I'll defer to either Jonah, who does some retail and commercial, or Alex, who works more with developers like that. I would generally say for this bill coming out of this committee now, the more flexibility you can empower, the better. And so if that's a lower percentage on the total square footage of floor space that needs to be committed to housing, I think that's a good idea. Again, you're here because like no change that the legislature can make is going to be on its own sufficient to stimulate new housing development, but everything's necessary. Regulatory reform, leveraging future tax dollars, incomes going up, interest rates going down. Like we have to create the environment. And I think
market tanking, tariffs, market tanking, all those things, so helpful. Right. So so I guess we'll pivot to Jonah and ask, would it be helpful? Do we need a percent dedicated to housing? I mean, because that's what we're thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Zeke. I mean, the more flexible we can be with this right now, I think the better. I will say we do, we do work on mixed use projects in our downtowns and village centers, which always require, retail on the ground floor. So, you wouldn't, in my opinion, I don't think it would make sense to do 100% housing for the requirement, because a lot of the projects that we would be applying for this program will necessarily have some mandated component of retail.
Right. We're at 50% now that it would need to be housing. What is there a percentage you think from your experience that makes sense for it to pencil out for you?
Retail development is a loss leader for us, and that's what we've seen the way our numbers work. Usually the rents that you can get per square foot on retail are far less than what you can get for housing. So while we try and we keep the if we're building a mixed use project like we just did here in Fairleigh, and we're planning another one across the street, we keep the front of the ground floor as retail and then the rest is housing. So I think 50% housing. I mean, I don't think we'd ever go less than that on a project, at least with our projects.
Thank you. Alex, anybody else have input on this?
Yeah, and I'd just add, obviously the reason I know these two developers well is because they're housing developers. And I think Senator Weeks' point before is, there may be cases where perhaps these folks, as well as the different developer, benefits from a project. And to speak to sort of point CHT made earlier, they'd love it to be primarily housing. Well, what lowering the threshold does is let you do whatever. So if you set the percentage down to 10%, fine, you can still build 100% housing. But if other development is needed, you could have that flexibility. And
And
for
so,
Pepsi's sake, it needs to
Given,
happen.
I know everybody's texting and in communication with each other. I would just like to know, what are people thinking? Because quite honestly, we know if we have economic development, we need to house people. We have heard time and time again in this committee that, oh, this company had a job open, but they couldn't find a place for the person to have, that they couldn't find housing and they left and didn't take the job. We've heard this so often. How can we make these go hand in glove so that we're enabling both public goods, both economic development and housing? Is there a sweet spot that we can land on in housing that would support a priority in these projects of being housing that makes some sense? Or do we leave it completely flexible and see how it is and check in on it and see how it's going in 3 years?
Megan and I aren't necessarily texting, but we're mind melding, I think, on this one.
Sure.
So there's two things that I see as being important to this proposal to ensure that it is, fair and meets public interest, but we do not overcomplicate it here. And that is to have, say, 2 criteria instead of the 5. One,
You meet 2.
you meet 2 out of the 5,
Yeah,
or there's
it has
just
to
2
be
different
2 out of
criteria and you
5,
meet
right.
one of them,
Yeah.
economic development or housing, but you have limited criteria. You have to meet 1 or 2 of those limited criteria, not a percentage. And then this needs a position like this. Someone needs to help smaller communities, and it's because we are allowing for more private involvement
Yes.
at a time when I think our colleagues will have a hard time supporting that, but we know that's the way to get the financing to move these things forward. So I see the best way to build in that flexibility, but to ensure oversight is to ensure there's somebody there who is managing all of this and is like a tax preparer, because they're like partially liable for when you get something wrong. Right now the town, the city becomes publicly, scrutinized when they put $1 million in the wrong place or whatever for a big TIF. We don't want smaller projects to get caught up in, did they meet this requirement? Did they not? Did they know they should have? But to me, that speaks to having someone who's going to walk them through the process and make sure it's airtight and meets the public interest.
So we have that at the moment with Bepsi. Bepsi is our partner on this, correct?
Well, they're not in the room.
Right.
Yeah, but they're partly in the room. We have Basil and Alex, and we knew we were talking about this morning. So,
David.
and we have David White, who's joined us, who I think may have some
Right.
input
But
here.
I do want to say, Bepsi right now with big TIFs, their role is not minimal, but it's, they're accepting your paperwork and looking it over, right? That, as someone like a David White or a, CFO for a town or a city is the one who's actually managing the funds. And I think what we heard from Bepsi is fine, but make it so, so flexible that we don't have to do very much to say yes. And I don't think that's going to work with our colleagues and with our need for real I dotted and T's crossed. So that's where I did. And I texted Chad.
But I don't have
VHFA.
I don't have an answer for that. If you're pushing for VHFA to have eyes on it, I don't know how we would build them in at the moment. But David White, you have some thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think I stated the other day, and it's still my thought that there shouldn't be income limits on this. It adds to the administrative complexity, but more importantly, it makes it harder for the developers to put it together. And I think the public good here is housing. We need housing. And personally, I favor retaining the 50% minimum square footage. I think it's easy to administer. It's very easy to, architects say, yeah, this is X square footage residential and Y square footage is non-residential. But to the extent that you involve another, and I have huge support and respect for VHFA. So this is by no means a criticism of VHFA whatsoever. They're a very, very critical housing partner in the state.
And they're on their way.
But they've got other roles and other things they do. And I think that in this case, I've accepted the idea that VEPSI staff shouldn't, be making decisions here, that should go to the board, that there are those kind of controls on it. But I think it's very important from my perspective that we not put these income limits in, because it's just one more complication that makes the process harder and is going to make it harder for the developers involved.
I think that is the feeling I'm getting around the committee, is that is also where we are. Is that correct, committee? Are we wanting?
I think
The housing requirement?
No, we're talking about income at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not a fan, but I mean,
Okay, so I Thomas?
Oh, yeah. I just want to get this bill out.
Yeah, me too.
Changing it.
So that is, I think, my concern at the moment with.
Can I ask David my question about oversight and staffing?
Sure.
David, I don't know when you got on, and I'm not sure if you heard what I was saying right before you spoke, but you are someone who helps people manage their fiscal responsibility and financial oversight with the big projects. I don't want to make it over prescriptive on our end, but I do think there needs to be someone designated to make sure that these communities and projects are able to meet that financial, that fiscal oversight, so that we don't just hear in 2 years from the auditor, like, this is loosey goosey and nobody knows what they're doing and it's building, swimming pools or whatever. I know better than most that to get this right and to make sure we maintain the public trust, somebody needs to be involved in developing at least the first few projects so that they meet the public good.
So thank you, Senator Rom Hinsdale. There are two sides to this financial piece. One side is the planning and projections. And as you prepare and you look at the project and try to determine on the front end, as you're putting the plan together, will it be feasible? What will the public improvements cost? Will the private projected private project be sufficient with regard to the incremental taxes it will generate to pay that? If not, what other sources can be used to help supplement the portion that would be paid through the incremental taxes? And how do you make that package one that makes sense and works? And then as a piece of that, the housing infrastructure agreement would spell out that what the developer's responsibilities are and what the municipality's responsibilities are, and how that's going to get paid for, and would have protections built in for the municipalities so that, and I want to be clear, I don't want to be prescriptive about this because each situation is unique, but the types of protections that we typically do in a TIF district would have provisions such as, again, it depends on the circumstances exactly what provisions are, but a typical one might be that the municipality doesn't begin to spend any money on its infrastructure until the developer has closed on his construction financing, so that you have that assurance that the project is moving forward. And that the project will actually get developed and generate those revenues. Now, it's not entirely risk-free. I suppose in theory, halfway through construction, something could stop it or what have you, but it's the kind of protection you build in. So there's that whole front-end planning piece that I think absolutely would require some form of consulting services, and it could be an outside private firm like White and Burke, but it could also be the regional Economic Development Corporation or the Regional Planning Commission often have expertise that could be used for this kind of work. And the way we develop the concept for CHIP, it would allow for the costs of that, whether it's private or you're paying to the Regional Planning Commission or Economic Development Commission to do it, that those costs are eligible costs as well to be paid through the incremental revenue. So that's the front end. The back end, when you've already got the projects up and running and you're looking at the cash flow of the whole deal, part of what we're trying to do, I think, in the vast majority of cases, municipalities can handle that on their own. Unlike a regular, a full TIF district, which is very complicated, the concept here is that it's so simple. You're dealing with one project, one project site, whether it's a single property or a few properties next to each other, but you're not having to track this whole area. So that from an accounting perspective, that should be relatively simple to do. We do not do that work, just to be very clear. We do not do the ongoing financial management. There are consulting firms that do that kind of work. We're not one of them. We're more on the front end and the negotiation and so forth and so on. But I think part of the goal here is to make this, because it's a single project, albeit it may be phased. There may be 3 buildings planned for that one that get built over a period of a few years. But it's still one project, one revenue source, and it should be fairly easy from that administrative perspective for a municipality to track it.
So we have the HFA in the room. And Chad hasn't had much time to think about this, although I know he and Aisha have been in communication about it. So I'm assuming that you've got a notion of what we're talking about.
Right.
So, David, you think help on the front end with the RPCs and the RDCs would also be called out, because we invest, those are public dollars invested in the RDCs and RPCs to help public good projects. And I don't know, I'm getting more confused. I think our first, so I think we have more questions on the table than I'd like. Thank you, Jonah. Sorry, Jonah had to leave. So Jonah has disappeared. Thomas.
Can I try grounding this conversation? Because I definitely would vote for this bill if we took away the housing requirement and took away affordable housing requirement. But I will say that I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I would support that, but I just think it's going to hit a very rough road in the rest of the building for a variety of reasons.
I don't know why.
Because it's about housing. We have a housing crisis
giveaways
that
Rob,
everyone's identified.
In other words, we can't build a project that winds up being composed solely of luxury housing. And that's the risk unless you put something in. But the risk of putting a number in, like we've been talking about, is the numbers. Frankly, I question the accuracy of them or the applicability to many places that we have when they're based on some of the measures that we have. And so the question is, could we use language to define what we're looking for? And that would be part of the approval process. And it could be that X number percent of this should be what is commonly referred to as workforce housing or as other things, and then be described using words rather than numbers. And that's a way to clearly make clear the intent of this, and also to put some guardrails around it, but without being overly prescriptive.
in the next hour.
So I have all kinds of questions for what you guys want.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled at the moment because I think we still have to make this decision. Housing, non-housing.
Can I
and or.
But actually, can I put my proposal back on the table and ask if Senator Chittenden, that satisfies your concerns, that with some criteria and an oversight entity that helps manage the meeting of that criteria, we do that rather than the percentage. I think we need to stop talking about.
Yeah, I agree. We should stop talking about percentage because again, A, they're inaccurate, B, they're hard to manage.
I think David is, and I don't think it would be hard, from what I'm hearing from our developers, it would not be hard to manage a percent of housing in a project. I don't want to spend, yes, all economic development is, it can be a public good, but I'm sorry, I don't think another set of retail, I don't think any development without housing. I think we're in a housing crisis and we need a percent.
Look at Brandon. Brandon is one of my favorite downtowns in the state, and the redevelopment of Brandon for pedestrian infrastructure and having a true downtown, mostly to support a strong, lovely Main Street retail corridor, is, I think, like one of the greatest economic development stories of recent times. So
Agreed. But
I-
I also think you first and foremost say we need to be spurring on housing development. And I think we have.
are you using my word of housing
We
against
need-
me, right?
We need housing. So I think I still think we need to call out housing in some capacity.
But that's the one of
Well,
two
let me
criteria.
give you just one very quick example. So in Rutland, by the airport, there's a small industrial park. They want to expand across the street. They need some infrastructure. So it has nothing to do with housing, but sure would help the region. So in this scenario, that project would not be, it wouldn't pass the litmus test.
Absolutely, it could, and you could have a great economic development pod right there, and it might also have 30% housing or whatever. Anyway, I put this out because I think this is where this project began. This came to us as a small way for us to incentivize housing and economic development in our smaller communities who weren't about to go through a whole tip.
And again, it's housing that's the crisis.
Yeah.
We could use other economic development of various kinds to be beneficial, and finding a way to do that, I think is important, but we have a housing crisis, and that's what we should be concentrating on.
Sure, but we could put that criteria in without setting a percentage.
Correct.
We could say
Correct.
it
We
means
could do it-
missing
we
middle
could do a
housing.
narrative, we could describe it, we could do other kinds of things to indicate what we want and have the decision-making authority make the decision after looking at the criteria we set.
Yeah.
If you just want, just thinking about time constraints here, if you actually want something by 11:30,
We do.
so if that's the case, then I can drop in something that is just a concept that does that. It says, includes housing affordable to folks at middle income or something along those lines, with the understanding that this would have to be worked out in the next chamber. But I can drop in a concept that does something like that, can eliminate the affordable housing piece. And
I can
You want to do that? Yeah, I have a problem.
And then we could also work out oversight. I think to do that on the fly at the moment. I think we have Betsy's agreement to partner on this. That's a beginning. And then we can work out further oversight. I'm looking at you, Chad, in the House. Zeke, you had your hand up. Sorry.
My only other grounding thought for this conversation, right, is for a developer or to utilize a project like this, right, we're going to look at like certainty, administrative burden, and potential proceeds, right, the size of the source. And I think what you guys are starting with is a program that has a decent administrative burden, not quite as much as a big TIF, but it's sort of the step down, right? And so I would encourage you in that to make this as simple as possible, because are going to be just a select number of municipalities, of projects that are going to choose to take on this burden. And so I would say, to the extent that's already built in, where you guys have opportunities, try to drop that sliding scale down on the restrictions. Where you get into other ideas, which hopefully in the future sessions, however we want to do it, that are less administrative burden, that's where I would really start narrowing in on the specific thing you're trying to incentivize, because that's something that can be a little more generally applicable. But in these that are going to sort of have some barriers to entry, I would say if you want more rural towns, if you want smaller projects, if you want, more out of this project, the limitations and the further administrative burdens should be as little as possible in this one. I hear the concern from Senator Brock that like you don't want this just to end up being a luxury apartment program. I don't see that as a major concern. I also know we need housing, right? And it's like units. There's not a huge tolerance if those are only luxury units. So I would understand the impulse to put something in that way, but I would just be really careful to make sure that this program, which is TIF light or not a big TIF, let's try to keep it simple. That's what's going to make developers want to use it. Municipalities want to use it.
Thomas?
I'm fine with luxury apartments. I just don't know if we should use ed fund redirect increment dollars to subsidize them.
And if you don't know, not getting through Senate Finance. So
I'll vote.
I think we're all in the same place, somewhere between too restrictive and not a luxury development that's being funded by the ed fund. We do need to find a place in the middle. And I do think it's criteria and a staff position.
Could we review the criteria at the moment?
Yes.
Can we review it against the larger TIF criteria?
I can pull up the statute. Although I think it just references affordable housing. So what you would do in this case is you would drop these first two definitions, 1 and 2 affordable housing. You wouldn't include these. I will scroll down to the project criteria, which are on page 8. Subsection D. Subsection C shall review that infrastructure project application to determine whether the housing development plan had at least 50% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development dedicated to housing. What you guys are proposing here, at least conceptually, is something like includes housing that is affordable to folks of middle income, something along those lines. And I'm stating it that way, just given time constraints. Like I think you're just trying to get a
I
concept
have
across.
a suggestion, and I'm looking at Chad. What if instead we say it meets our missing middle criteria for rental and homeownership? We have criteria built in to those programs for rental and homeownership
Correct.
at different AMI levels.
Chad Simmons, Vermont Housing Finance Agency. The reason why I wear these goofy little things is because I do try to pay attention. So thank you for this conversation. I think it's really important. I think VHFA's perspective is that we need a little more time to figure out how to balance what the committee is trying to thread. We don't want to make this program too burdensome for developers to take advantage of. And our mission is to create affordable housing. So I think, as Senator Ron Hinsdale mentioned, there is current statute or current legislation that does point to 150% of AMI as middle income. Our agency tends not to use the term workforce housing because most everyone works who need housing and is in that situation. So we would be okay with any reference to middle income or pointing to existing law that has that AMI level.
Okay, we're still.
And we would be very happy to work with the committee and the other chamber to figure out.
I think we're gonna have to do that for that.
Let's ask a question though regarding AMI. The AMI that we're talking about in these visions that Senator Ron Hinsdale mentioned, does that use the AMI that considers Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties a single district?
Yes, yeah,
So
the
people-
AMI thresholds are based on HUD definitions.
And
HUD market
that's the
values,
problem, is the HUD definitions are wildly inaccurate in terms of various parts of districts that of these sizes.
My understanding of this threshold, that doesn't hurt
Yeah.
the districts outside of Chittenden County. If anything, the Chittenden
Yeah.
County raises
Right.
it up, so it makes it even easier.
Right.
Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right.
Theoretically,
I think
But
you're
good
right.
in that case.
but is it not accurate?
It's not accurate.
It's not accurate.
180,000 is a little bit more luxury
Yeah.
if you're like in Enosburg Falls
And if you're
than,
in Richford, it's.
right. But it does capture St. Albans, which is climbing up.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
climbing
it is.
up there.
But I don't think it hurts you in this case. I know it could hurt you in some cases.
And they're gonna still meet the market.
You're right.
Yeah, okay.
It's actually better
Yeah.
for Franklin County.
We're helping Richford out.
It is better. We are happy. So of these two criteria, let's go back to the criteria because our time is limited. We have two criteria here. Keisha, you were proposing that instead of on number 2, that the projected housing development is meets the middle income, the missing middle income level identified by statute.
And I don't know how you'd frame this, but it would capture the homeownership and the rental levels.
Okay, so there are two questions here. Do you want either of these criteria, or do you just want one criterion that says includes housing, meaning it doesn't specify a particular percentage, but just says includes housing that is affordable to, and I can speak with VHFA folks to work out what that reference to middle income would be. But basically, the criteria would just be, you've got housing in this development that you're doing, and some portion of it is affordable. We're not specifying what, but some portion of it is affordable to folks at this.
Yes.
I am trying to honor Senator Weeks and say, maybe there are two criteria and you have to meet one or the other, that it's like necessary infrastructure or it's missing middle housing.
If you switch to a whole, so that is it's fine if you guys want to do this.
But
It changes the whole bill, is what I
Yeah.
would say. So
sure,
if you want to have something passable in an hour and a half that I have written and has been edited, it will be very hard to do that unless you want it to not be functional, is the, like, I can.
I don't
No,
want
I
to
don't-
be driven by an 11:30 deadline. That's
I am driven by an 11:30 deadline. I'm sorry. That's what we're
for
driven.
the whole
by.
housing bill.
On the housing bill,
That's
but we can also have amendments that we can continue to work on next week, because this is going to take a while to make it through our other committees. And it isn't the whole housing bill. The whole housing bill is what we will vote on the Senate floor at the end of crossover. So I think we have plenty of time to be working on the other pieces that have been introduced.
we did confuse people that way last year. That was confusing.
I think our senators are able to deal with the fact that a bill has to make it out of a committee like crossover, and we can add elements to it. That's what we're proposing to do with labor. That we can do that during the course of the next week. And I think if we're going to include everything we want, I think that's what we're
I'm
going to.
looking at the two of you because I think we do a service to the other committees that have jurisdiction over these issues if we got it right for what we think. If they're looking at language that we're like, well, we kind of like that, but we're working on this, that doesn't help
It
finance.
could be tough to the money committee.
Yeah.
But I think having a housing component is easy and it will help in that finance conversation. And then we get that of
Yeah,
finance,
that's
and we have an
housing.
amendment to address Senator Weeks.
It's
fine too.
All it says at the moment is includes housing that is affordable, and you will work on the line.
Yeah, I mean, basically you can do something like what big, and let me just share what Big Tip
It
does.
doesn't say
Well,
percent.
you're doing that. I just like to say, I don't know that we're gonna get a housing bill done by 11:30.
Well, we're going to do our damnedest.
I have no plans tonight.
I do. You also have children.
Basically, the new criterion would be like what you see for B here. This is what's in place for big TIF districts. Development includes new and rehabilitated affordable housing as defined in 24 VSA 4303. 4303 is the placeholder language you saw before, which has those 80% and 120% figures distinguishing between owner occupied and rental housing. And to be clear, this doesn't specify that a particular percentage has to.
Right.
I would need to do different than this, because that does pick up specified percentage. It picks up 20%. So it just needs to be includes. I'll speak with VHA. If you guys want something shortly, I need to get out of the chair and
Yeah.
do it. So
Okay, and then we can go through the rest of the bill. Are we okay landing in that spot? Committee.
What is the spot? I'm looking at David, because I could go either way, but I don't want to rush this for 11:30 just because that.
So the question is, there's another place or something that we're working on right now in which language that Senator Weeks is interested in could be placed.
Yeah, but
Put it
this
in
is,
finance.
it's all economic development. It is, and all we're asking is a percent. It is not a percent, is that housing be included as an element.
Senator Brock and I can carry this into our Senate
Yeah.
Finance discussion and tackle it there next week.
So I'm not quite sure where we're going. It's just kind of an and or.
Let's see.
Listen, and.
It's and.
Well, the question is for Josh, is that going to create an issue for you, or do you feel that you're comfortable with the outlines of what you've done so far to be able to include that potential switch?
I can add a single, it would replace the existing project criteria with a new single project criterion that is just includes, and I'll work out what the affordable housing language is, to the broader question of, could I be prepared to switch this entirely to a broader project-based approach? If people have that interest in the upcoming days, like, just talk to me and I'll just need lead time to do something like that. Is all I'm trying to say.
Right.
The only final question I have, because we're not. The criteria would say, yes, it has to have some missing middle housing. Is it? I want to make sure we answer what I think was Senator Weeks' underlying concern, that things could change. So, or that the scope of the project that's being financed is something in service to housing. So I just want to make sure that the project could be infrastructure, and it is in service in part to housing,
Yeah,
but the housing is not, doesn't have to be
We established that the other day.
The primary.
it doesn't have to be the primary.
yeah,
or-
there's no requirement for that. The improvements are just
Okay.
putting in infrastructure and the funnel to get in, to get the funds, the financing for it is that you have to include housing.
Some
It doesn't
missing middle
prohibit
housing.
anything.
We have,
other
we've now
than-
eliminated the percent.
Oh, you're
It's
welcome.
just saying that's what you have to check to get in the door. That's
Okay.
Really.
And I think
kind of-
that satified both our economic development needs in this committee and our housing
That's what
needs.
they're doing with you.
Okay,
Why did
I'm
you
gonna
bring
run.
one plum?
and-
Please.
So Chad,
Thank you.
Chad and David, if you need to weigh in with John as well, but Chad and John, if you be, and John, if you just communicate with Heidi and let us know when you're ready to come back.
And I'm sorry to everyone that we're perpetuating the missing middle, even though it's not. Okay.
Middle.
Pat, I can't deal with
Yeah.
middle.
Yes.
Can we break this out?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we rename the program middle income.
It's middle, yes.
Thank you.
okay, this is the AMI chart that we're all getting printed out. You want a copy?
Sure.
I just emailed
Thank
it.
you.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, that, if we could print it out, that was great.
So that's-
Sure.
Thank
And
you.
yeah,
I'm not on the
Pam,
spot
here it
here.
is.
He said he was heading over and I haven't seen him.
So we will see that and committee, I would suggest we take a 10-minute break till 9:30. Come back at 9:30 and we're gonna, once Pam is with us, we're gonna walk. Yeah, well.
You're giving us a break, Madam Chair?
Yeah, we're gonna have a-
8:41 is the next hour. 8:41.
If that is the draft, I believe that's the